I'm delighted to introduce today Timothy Taylor, who is both a novelist and a journalist. He's been shortlisted for many of Canada's major literary prizes without winning any of them. Except for the CBC Bookie Prize. Timothy tells me he suspects he won this by popular vote because a group of anonymous street artists and graffiti writers voted for him, possibly but not provably, more than once each. Anyway, he came to UBC in 2013 and has continued to publish novels and articles since then and talk to students who are interested in doing the same. In that vein, and as a faculty member, he does some teaching here on campus. He's currently heading Creative Writing 570, which is a special course running in collaboration with physics and creative writing, called Storytelling, Persuasion, and Physics. I'm sitting in on the class, Tim's in the class, Susan's in the class, Nicholas is in the class. I've been enjoying every minute of it. It's great. And he's one of the artists on this season of Ars Scientia, which is why he's here today, and maybe he's going to talk a little about some of his involvement in Ars Scientia. He also has a new novel out next year, which is about the rise and fall of a celebrity chef, so we can look forward to that. But please join me in welcoming Timothy.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And students in that 570 course, it's not good for extra marks, but I appreciate it. It's meaningful. More of me. That seems above and beyond the call. So yeah, thanks, James, for that introduction. On that Bookie Prize thing, I just suspect, I don't know for sure, but I think I got the local Banksy vote, and they're always, they punch above their weight, those guys. So I became the artist in residence at the Quantum Matter Institute as of January this year, but I've been wearing the sweatshirt ever since they let me. So. And I've been wearing it so much it's actually wearing out a little bit, so I don't know who I talked to about that, but maybe before I go we can have a chat about the replacement. I've been really pleased to take this role and to get involved with the QMI generally. And I was asked to talk today a little bit about the residency so far. So as James kind of sketched, it has kind of two components. One is this student-facing component, which is a course. And we are working together on developing a kind of a rhetoric for the purpose of popular communications. And so the end product for each of the students is a popular science article addressing some component of the physics going on here at QMI, or in some cases addressing the notion of arts science collaboration in itself, which creates a fascinating conversation, separate but related. The other part of it is the scarier part for me. It's a book. I agreed to write a book. This is very unusual in my experience. I've written a lot of them. I think this will be number 10. I can't remember, but they've all been not very much like this one, in the sense that I always knew quite a lot more about what was going to go into the book before anybody knew I was writing it. And in this case, I agreed to write it with fairly well in advance of knowing what might go in it. So I did know from the outset that working together with Jeff Mair, who I'm really grateful is here today, that we were going to go to QMI and we were going to listen and we were going to meet people, we were going to react, we were going to speculate about the things that we came across, we were going to understand very little of it, and that was somehow going to produce art. And so that was an exciting enough prospect. Plus, we came up with a title very quickly, which really got me excited. So we decided, I think within the first day of being here, and I'll talk more about this later, but that we were going to call this book Momentum Space. And so I've gotten a lot of traffic out of just telling people, yeah, I'm working on a book, it's called Momentum Space. And then people go, whoa, that's cool. So, I'm already paid for this book, actually, because I've gotten a lot of credit just from that name. So thank you all for coming up with it. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that idea has been bouncing around in my head for the past 8 to 10 months now. So in terms of a progress report, I sort of want to manage expectations at the outset. Jeff has done amazing work already. He's down the road in terms of, and he's presented on this, so I won't repeat or comment on that except to say that there are people in the room who contributed to the high entropy oxide pigment project, which has produced beautiful results, some of which you've seen. And Jeff is working on a range of other really exciting things, some of which will be a great surprise for everybody when they show up in the book. And what we're doing together is sort of integrated, sort of not. We respond to each other's work, but the idea was never that the text either be an explanation or that the art be an illustration. These things live together, hopefully in a kind of symbiotic way. I've been teaching this course, as I mentioned, so not a lot of original writing getting done, but lots of thinking. Trust me, lots of thinking. And I've been pestering everyone who will stand still long enough for an interview at QMI, so many of you, some who are in this room, know that I've been sort of thinking about things and asking questions. So what I want to do today, instead of like reading about a chapter, which isn't that much fun anyway, listening to somebody read a chapter is not that great. So is I'm going to talk a little bit about my history of as a writer, not because it's so important that you know my history, but that it does offer some clues as to my approach to the inquiry of writing in both fiction and nonfiction. And that really leads in a somewhat predictable, although in my personal case entirely unanticipated way, to this residency here at QMI. So that's what we'll be doing today. Talk a bit about that, turn to my coming to UBC, which is relatively recent in academic years, only having been 10 years ago, and then the projects I've worked on since then. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I can't really start talking about my life as a writer without acknowledging this person here. This is Mavis Gallant. Mavis was born, she was raised largely in the Montreal area, born in 1922. We're not related, but she became a big influence on me in a sort of quiet and growing way over the years. And I wanted to talk briefly about that because I can trace it to certain specific elements in her work. And I think hopefully by the end of today, you'll see in some ways how that is teasing itself out even within the context of this residency. So Mavis went from being a young and somewhat unhappy child, not a bit of a peripatetic childhood, going from place to place, an independent young woman, fiercely intelligent, super funny. I met her a number of times, worked on a documentary film about her, so I got to know her a bit. One of the highlights of my nonfiction career was getting to know Mavis a bit. And she became a writer as a young woman at the Montreal Standard, and that was an unusual job for a young woman to have at the time, to have a byline job at a newspaper, almost always controlled by men, those newsrooms. But it was the war, and she'd got a place, and then they kept her because she was very, very good. And as I said, just an incredible intellectual energy that people really valued. She went on in 1948, she dumped it all. She said, I'm leaving, I'm going to Paris, and that's what she did. And so I admire her in part because I met her, and she said some really interesting things that have resonated with me over the years, in part because I just really admire the way she went and, as they say in jazz, she just did the shit, man. She didn't care about the trappings of writing, she just wanted to do it. So she quit. She was married to a jazz guy, named Johnny Gallant was his name. And Johnny Gallant, I can only imagine what Johnny looked like. No pictures survive as far as I'm aware. He was a trumpet player. Anyway, she left him, and she left the Montreal Standard, and she split for Paris in 1948. And she said about that decision, I wanted to live in Paris and write nothing but fiction and be perfectly free. I decided all this had to be settled by the time I was 30, and so I gave up my job, and I moved to Paris at 28. And I just held my breath and jumped, and I didn't even look to see if there was water in the pool. She's great. She was. May she rest in peace. And I loved talking to her. But one added thing I want to say about what she did that has really stuck with me. She brought her lens to bear on Europe in a very particular time, which is post-war. And during this time, as many of you know a bit about history, millions of people are moving in the world. There's a lot of migration going on. People have lost their homes. They're finding new homes. They're making connections that they didn't have before. The very notion of home in Europe and by extension in many parts of the Western world are in great flux. And Mavis brought her lens very frequently onto that population. And that has become sort of important to me over the years. My parents were caught up in this very much. My mother was a Holocaust survivor from Germany and a refugee after the war. And my dad was kind of a nomad. He just traveled all over the place through Asia and kind of didn't settle down for a long time. Then he met my mom in Guayaquil. So my patterns, my historical patterns, have a lot in common with the populations that seem to rivet Mavis. And that drew me to her fiction. And it's probably no accident that the title of hers that I admire the most is called Varieties of Exile, because I think Mavis really saw that in people, and maybe in people who didn't necessarily see it in themselves, or who others didn't acknowledge for their rootlessness and the degree to which they had tenuous relationships to place. Mavis saw it, and so that book, Varieties of Exile, has been very influential for me. So she jumped ship, that's a key thing about her, but she also had this lens onto things that really mattered to me. Now, as for me as a young writer, so that's me at 28. So that's me when roughly Mavis made her big jump ship decision. And as you can judge from the expression on my face, I no longer work for the bank, where I had a perfectly good job. It was a job that my mother and father both thought was a pretty good job. My dad more stridently so, and questioned in some direct language whether there was a lot of thoughtfulness in my decision. But of course there wasn't, because I hadn't looked to see if there was water in the pool. I had decided I wanted to become a writer, so that's me on Hastings Street with a new chair I've just bought for my office in this fabulous building downtown called the Dominion Building, which is on Victory Square. The Dominion Building is, that's a great old storied building. The architect's last name was Hellier, and he died right after finishing the building by tripping and falling down the central staircase of this building and landing on the first floor where the stairway stopped. And the elevators were haunted. I can attest to this. They stopped sort of randomly on the first floor as if to pay tribute, but then they weren't haunted again after they replaced the elevators. So I always missed the old haunted elevators. In any case, I went down there and, you know, it was my Paris. What can I say? You know, it wasn't as exotically far away, but it had a lot of the same features. It was really fresh. It was really new. It was full of exciting people. I met a lot of artists during time. That's Victory Square. I wrote almost my entire first novel sitting there with a black notebook, scribbling away, feeling like a fool, trying not to think of what my father had told me, writing this novel. And there I was, you know, sort of doing it down there on the downtown east side. I met, as I indicated earlier, a lot of artists during this time. Here are three, at least one of whom shall remain unnamed because they probably had something to do with the Blue Light Project winning that prize. But there's Take Five on the left, well-known graffiti writer here. On the right is a guy named Germ9, and then in the middle, a guy who went by the name Cameraman, whose name will come up a little later. Cameraman's, I don't know if you can make it out there, he papered a dumpster to look like a Louis Vuitton handbag. And that was quite the talk of gas down there for a while. So these were my downtown east side years, and what I'm telling you about them for, in service of, is really to draw attention to the kind of work that pushing myself out of the nest and into the uncertainly filled pool, what that effect that had on my writing. So I wrote more than this down there, but I wrote 3 novels during that time. I ended up being down there for almost 25 years, so I don't want to make this sound like a brief waypoint in my career. That was me for a very long time, down there at the Dominion Building, in the same office up there on the top floor looking out over the terminal. I felt like some kind of shipping magnate, although I most certainly wasn't. And it didn't cost that much until the very last years when I was there. But I wrote these books, and so these 3 novels are kind of illustrative of where I'm going with all this, which is they're all really not very much about me. Every writer inserts themselves, every writer has a set of experiences that bleed into the things that they participate in, that they watch, and that they try to interpret. We can't get ourselves out of the research experiment that is our writing. Nevertheless, I really tried. I sort of turned my eye to other communities because I was fairly convinced that I wasn't very interesting myself, and I was really interested in other people. So across the range of these books, I talked to chefs and line cooks and restaurateurs, and I talked to architects, and I talked to guys who specialized in counterfeit brand name products, and later to street artists and to a whole range of people involved in the security industry and psychiatry and other areas. So these books really pushed me out there, but it was really not that much of a practical difference or changing of gears from what I was doing in nonfiction that whole time too, writing for all of these magazines that I slapped up there and various newspapers. I wrote for these people, and I was doing the same thing. I was pushing myself out into the world and trying to meet people and understand their worlds and bring back some knowledge that I could share with people, not to educate them particularly, but to illuminate them as to the lives lived. That was really my project as a nonfiction writer, and that's how I paid the rent at that fabulous Dominion Building for all those years. So I guess my key point here is the externalizing of the writing project, the focusing on other people's projects, the voracious curiosity that I've always had for how people do their thing, for how people live their lives, and maybe a little less about myself, which leads me to a sort of fundamental conflict that I have occasionally sensed that I have with the rest of the writing pedagogy community. You may have heard this many times before. It's pretty commonly quoted. It's attributed to Mark Twain, in fact, and I just flat dispute that. I don't think he ever said it. If he did say it, he would have said it in some different, more clever way. And anyway, he didn't say this. He couldn't possibly have said this. I don't think it's right at all. It wouldn't have worked for me at all to do it that way. And I say this partly because I'm persuaded by Benjamin Franklin, who observed that experience, as he, in his words, keeps a dear, which is to say expensive school, and yet fools will learn at no other. And if you have taken a course with me of almost any kind, you will have learned that I have a fondness for logical fallacies and the way that they can be used to inform rhetoric. And here is such an example. Experience, of course, fails on the basis of a number of really key biases of reason, which is, I could name a couple, but memory is one of them. Of course, we can only cite our memory to the extent that we remember it, and we choose to forget a lot of things, typically, including the things where we didn't perform so well. So it's biases of memory, what of all you forget, I think is the key question you have to ask. And then there are the inherent biases of our lives. The circumstances of our birth dictate a lot of what ends up becoming our experience. So you could think of it this way, your experience is a subset of possibility and not the reverse, right? So basing your decision on experiences is difficult, or perhaps potentially misleading. And lastly, the one that's really hard on all of us as we push up into our advanced years is superannuation. We all learn the things we learned at a certain time, and things change. What you know has a stale date in some cases. So this is me pushing outside of myself, and if I were to give a single emblem then for the writing practice that developed, this is my writing practice. My writing practice is about 150 moleskin notebooks and spiral bind notebooks and then little flip notebooks and every single bit of paper that I could get my hands on. And you will see that this idea of a log becomes important in this presentation today. You will see that as a kind of binding energy between me and other types of practitioners and lives. But this very much captures me. There's hardly a moment when, as a writer, I am not, in my own estimation, doing my job best when I'm frantically trying to take notes so that I'll remember some of the key things that I'm observing and hearing. And that's a takeaway, I think, for me when I think about that's only a fraction of the total collection in any case. So how do I revise that writing rule? Write what you know, having established that I don't believe you should write what you know, or you can't limit yourself to that. I would say probably write what you want to know, or write what you're curious to learn about, or write towards what confuses you, or maybe write towards what causes you to reflect and speculate. So, write everything down that you see, hold your breath, jump, don't look to see if there's water in the pool. Now, this next slide might seem a bit counterintuitive given that jumping into the pool analogy that I keep using. So 2013. I came to UBC almost exactly 10 years ago, come to think about it. So that might seem like a bit of a cop-out in the whole jumping into the waterless pool thing. Kind of a cushy academic job to end the career, tiptoe through the twilight years. But I want to at least stress that I came here for idealistic reasons, even if those have been largely chased away. But I thought that for a curious person, there could hardly be a better place. If you like talking to other people about their work, if you're in investigation mode most of the time, if you take a lot of notes, then where would you want to be other than a big place where all of these intellects working on their separate projects are camped out in the same city? Our main mall is a great illustration. You walk down it and it's computer science and linguistics and education, and then you get to the business school and the music school, which is one of my favorites. I hate to think they're tearing that building down, but I hear it can't be earthquake-proofed. But I went in there for the first time when I had just arrived, and this reminded me of when I would go to the conservatory as a kid when I was studying piano, and you would stand in the lobby and you could hear from all over the building, you hear the sound of people practicing, someone doing scales up there, and a door would open, you'd hear it a bit more clearly, and then it would close and get quiet again. And it was just a brilliant feeling to be in a place where all these people were striving and trying and getting better and honing their craft. What an exciting thing. I was pretty idealistic when I got here. I was feeling rosy about the possibilities of all these interdisciplinary overlaps. And I saw myself having, bumping into a botanist at the water cooler and, taking an economist for lunch, and that, having a chat about epidemiology with somebody at a late afternoon coffee. These are the things that seemed like the university should deliver. And of course, it isn't really that. It doesn't do that. We're all busy doing our own things, and silos are real, and they're not entirely negative. We kind of have to focus here. So it's not all about satisfying the whimsical curiosities of some writer wandering on through. But I did find myself looking for ways that I could get this impulse out there and satisfy them, and that's where I wanted to turn to briefly next. I've had some interesting opportunities to do cross-disciplinary work, and the first one that I think amounted to something quite meaningful to me was this project that I did with UBC Sustainability. 2014, I think, was the year. These SEEDS folks, as they are known, Social, Ecological, Economic Development Studies, put out a call for people who might like to work with them from various disciplines to bring their disciplinary understanding to the table to sort of help them talk about sustainability on campus. So I'm fairly fresh off writing a book about street artists. And there had been a time that I remembered quite clearly while I was researching that book. We have a very well-known, I think, I'm calling him well-known is fair, photographer from Vancouver. His name is Lincoln Clarks. And I was walking around the downtown east side, and Lincoln was doing what he does, was going for one of his big Socratic walks. And he bumped into me in Victory Square, and I told him what the project I was working on, and he said, street art is a gift to the city, he said, and then off he strode. He's like in a cape or something, I don't know. But street art as a gift to the city was an idea that stuck with me, and when I thought about sustainability on campus, I thought, there's not a lot of surprising things to discover on campus in terms of what you might encounter where you say, wow, that's not supposed to be there, that's unusual. And so I talked to them about that. I said, I've done some work with street artists, and why don't you bring the creativity and energy of those people, or people who are thinking along those lines, and let's do installations that have some text component. Let's stick them up on campus and see what we have. I had originally thought all kinds of things, like a parkade covered in graffiti, and you can imagine that was just kiboshed at like the first meeting. It's like nothing was going to be painted on any wall. And nothing was going to, there was a lot of nothings, and there was a lot of immediately no. But what was kind of thrilling about this project is there were a whole lot of people in the room. Suddenly we were talking with the arborist. There was a mechanical engineer who specialized in wood, whose place would have been, where are we here? Would have been right over there, the woodworking facility across Agronomy Road. So we were all hunkered in together, and with the sustainability people and talking about these projects, and we decided to make a course out of it. So this was the first 570 that I taught, actually, was that distant from the physics course, was dealing with the idea that students who are in creative writing might like to create text that they mount on campus in some way. This one here, I think, was particularly successful, which is why I'm showing you pictures of it. It's called Places of Refuge. The artist is actually that gentleman reading a book there. Chris Evans is his name. And what Chris did is he took his skills as a nonfiction writer, and he went out into the student population and found people who were studying here but who had been refugees. He interviewed them, he talked to them about their relationship with UBC. He got 4 or 5 of those stories, and our wood engineer guy found a big old log that was being stored, or a slice of a log, I think, that was being stored in the facility down there. And they lasered those stories onto the log, made it the back of a bench, and then they made these birdhouses that hung in the tree just at the south end of Buchanan Sea. It was kind of cool, actually. It was colorful, it was big, everyone kind of stopped and looked at it. I think there are 2 birdhouses left. They've removed the Places of Refuge sign because it began to fade. But it lasted a long time. That was a good project, and it spoke, I think, to the possibilities of people talking different languages coming into the same room and saying, what are we going to do here? This one, too, really had staying power, and you might have seen these signs around. This project was done by a student named Saskia Walsack, who was in the interesting position of doing creative writing and botany at the same time. So she was very interested in botanical gardens and very interested in interpretive signs. And so she decided to make this, there were 150 or 200 of these things, these little signs that illuminated foliage and plants of various kinds around campus, but in somewhat surprising and unexpected ways. So the one that you might be able to read up there is actually a quote from Sappho, "Without warning, as a whirlwind swoops on an oak, love shakes my heart." So these were very surprising, unexpected. They were not what you expect from an interpretive sign. Saskia had a ball with this one, and it spread all over campus. It was really fun. And I thought it was also an example of what is very successful in these types of projects. I had hardly any role in this one at all. Saskia did all of this work. But it was fascinating just to sit in the room and watch this come together. I want to tell you about one more before we move to QMI. This one was done with UBC Campus and Community Planning. And when Achievement Square was not yet completed, the administration was sort of wondering how, I think the reasoning went sort of like this. They were going, this is a big, empty, kind of cold space. And it's going up very slowly, and we're removing trees to make it go up. So the whole thing has a kind of it's potentially an off feel to it. So how do we make people invest in this space and get involved and try to have fun and anticipate in advance how this space might be a real part of their university experience? So I went to my friend, cameraman, whose name is Byron Dauncey, who was very good with certain types of installations in the street art world. And I plugged him into the campus and community planning people. And he came up with this fridge magnet game, which was a magnetic board with a plan of the square on it, and he cut out these little figures that people would then come by and put into place. And yes, there were some inappropriate scenes that were constructed by students. That's sort of what you expect. But there was a lot more of just stopping and looking and laughing and people taking their picture with it. And I thought it was successful in that regard. That's my kid, by the way, down there in the corner. He's about 8 or something. Actually, it's not true. I'm not going to go to QMI quite yet because I wanted to speak of one other very important sort of turn and development in this progression of collaborative projects that I'm describing here. And I'd better speed up. This Campus Botanica was followed by the fridge magnet game, and then I began to do work with the Belkin Gallery. And I like this project in particular, which was, this was the artist, Shelley, help me out. It's in my notes right here. Louis Chemnitzer, right? And it's a beautiful quote which speaks, I think, to the heart of what these collaborative projects can do. The museum becomes a school where the artist communicates with the public who makes connections. 2 projects that I did with the Belkin, one about the photography of Ai Weiwei from 83 to 93, and the other about the art of Raymond Caillal. And in both cases, a novel that I had worked on was the starting point, and the conversation went out from there. In the case of the Ai Weiwei, I spoke with a historian, Carla Nappi, and she took a particular cut through the material, as a historian might, situating us in the sequence of events that these photographs represented. And I analyzed them more from a narrative standpoint, where they put us in Weiwei's story. And here I talked with Tony Phillips, who's a doctor in psychiatry at the Faculty of Medicine. And I highlighted some psychiatric disorders that I had researched for my book. And he spoke of what is sickness and how is this diagnosed and how is it treated. And I spoke instead of how a sickness situates itself as a cultural phenomenon. I want to move quickly through that, though, so I can get to this gorgeous building here, QMI, and a project that came across my plate just a little less than a year ago. And let's talk a little bit more about what I have been doing here since I got here. So these are slides that I stole from an architecture website. I have given them credit, but they are somewhat radically devoid of people, except for 2 people there, which is immediately what I would say is not my impression, having started my engagement with you folks at QMI. One thing that is really struck me, of course, is the populations of people here, and that, I think, has struck both Jeff and I. So the project, the course there, and the book that I'm working on with Jeff, and very crucially facilitated by James, who is busy collecting himself an Excellence in Service Award there in the photograph, but manages to fit us in the cracks. And then all of the people who have spoken to us, and we've been pestering a lot of people with a lot of questions. So to me, QMI is characterized more by its populations than by its beautiful spaces, although the latter can be acknowledged too. But let's talk a bit about what exactly I've encountered here that's sort of been striking me. And that brings me to the idea of surfaces. This is something that struck Jeff and I quite quickly. This is actually a photo from your own website, so I'm stealing it, but it's for your use. But this sort of thing is very striking to a visitor the first time you walk into the building. If you walk in, I suppose, with a curious eye to sort of look around and see what's going on. There are two things about this that, of course, are very striking. One is that they're hieroglyphs, for the most part, to non-math, non-physics people. But the other part is that they're everywhere. And there's a feeling that this language on the walls, and you may sense my fascination carrying over from my fascination with graffiti and street art, that there is this communication that is done in a public way. So the landings of the staircase shown in that first set of photographs, there are the whiteboards where each landing is sort of populated by the ideas of people who have met there. There's evidence here of people exchanging information more, in a way, than there is evidence of me not understanding what the hell you're talking about. And that is really compelling as a writer, that evidence of the human hand and that evidence of the community behind it. That is me reacting to all of this in my typically perplexed way. Note that there's a notebook in my hand. Now, I want to draw your attention to one aspect of this surface, this idea of surface. You know, I think many of us will have had the experience of going to a foreign city where we don't have the language, and on your first or your second day out wandering, if it's Tokyo, it'll look like this, but it will look different in different parts of the world. You may be struck by how the surfaces advertise to you the human activity, but you can't make out what's going on. And at first, it can be quite disorienting in what I would characterize as a sort of pleasant disorientation. It's okay to be lost. It's okay to not know what's going on. But if you stop to look, and Tokyo happens to be very good at this because there's a lot of signage, you look and you realize you don't just know broadly, you don't just fail to know broadly what's going on. You don't know any of the details. What is that exactly, and why is that there, and where's that person going? It's all really, really rather confusing. And the surface seems, as if by design, to inform you of this. That surface idea has been a tremendously important part of what I have seen here at QMI, but I want to show you a way that it seems to me the surfaces break down. You know, on your third day or your fourth day, as you're looking, say, at a place like Shibuya, which is the picture here, you begin to recognize elements of what's happening. You begin to learn how to interpret what people are saying, or you begin to sort of understand the dimensions of a transaction, how something is a routine for someone, how it could be a routine of yours. You begin to see how certain transactions are completed. Or you learn to manipulate machines in the landscape, like this fabulous box that allows you to order aburi ramen outside of a restaurant in Asakusa. So these are things that you steadily learn, and you steadily get your hand into things, and you feel the human activity behind. I'm a fan of transportation systems. So the moment that I can look at a grid of colors and go, yep, I got it. I'm supposed to get on the 7 train because it's green, right? It's not as full at this hour. Then I feel like I am really penetrating to the heart of these affairs. It's like, I'm getting it now. I'm pretty much a local. You have some surfaces that have this same effect on people. And I got to tell you that I love these. It's one of life's great truths, I think, that we fail to remember what it was like not to know the stuff we know. It's hard to estimate what ignorance feels like in the path of ignorance that we followed ourselves. What was it like not to really know every single part of that thing? For me, it's a fantastic absence of knowledge of any kind. I stare at those surfaces and I see nothing but the communication of task and intent and purpose without understanding any of it. It's really kind of beautiful. I find that one particularly beautiful. It reminds me somehow, call me crazy, it reminds me of like an interstellar probe, except that it's not heading outwards, it's heading inwards. I like that a lot. I like the, forgive me if you're ARPA's people, but there's an oddly militarized, weaponized quality to the ARPA's machinery with that black hut of a laser next to it, and that really rather ominous, incredibly dense and confusing thicket of lenses and reflectors that allow the laser to be focused in on the sample. All of this is really rather spectacular. I'm a visitor standing at Shibuya Crossing when I look at these things, and I'm looking up at the signs, and they're beautiful, but I can't tell what's going on. These shimmering surfaces with their hidden intent and power, all of the suggested stories. But then, things steadily begin to crack, and you begin to see the human hand, and you begin to enter the space. And this is a quest for understanding, so this begins to feel like the first part of it. I loved having those pointed out to me downstairs in Mair. I remember seeing that one of the drawers was labeled things that are sticky or sharp. I like that. Honesty in labeling. This is really quite beautiful. These are objects. Somebody's kept them. They're not using them anymore. They're artifacts. I'm an artifact guy. I can appreciate that. I looked at those knobs and things. I haven't a clue what those are for, and yet they're kind of treasured. I can see the degree to which they're treasured. I can see the degree to which they would be moved around and very, very reluctantly thrown away. Probably never. This one struck me too. The evidence of a project over a long period of time. The kind of project that somebody's poured themselves into. Investment, personal investment, that comes through to that series of photographs about the STM installation in the basement here. It tells a story. Logbooks, I said, were a feature of this whole conversation, so I'm going to quickly cover that now. Some of these photographs are by Jeff, and there's a credit in the corner there. These are not processed, so just be aware of that. If Jeff uses these, they'll be much better photographs. But for now, he let me use them. I love these books. This one happened to be written on my birthday, which is nice. I love the entries. I love the complex evidence of the activity behind them. I really, really like this coffee stain. I think this coffee stain is really, really beautiful. I want to say a quick thing about beauty. In art, it's considered very problematic to use the word beauty. In literature, you might get fired for saying it. I don't know if it's because the last century was so terrible and the 21st century hasn't proven to be much better. We're sort of suspicious of the concept of beauty. There's a lot of beauty around here. There's a real, the optical furnace glows with a certain kind of beauty, all 1400 degrees Celsius of it, with the two rods coming together and that crystal slowly forming. The first time I saw one of these, I think I was talking to Sarah Burke, and I said to Sarah, is that real space? And Sarah was either pretending to be excited or she shared the excitement in the moment, and she said, that's real space. And I got goosebumps. That's real. Theoretically, if I was small enough, I could see that. This too really struck me. This molecular surface is revealed by the scanning tunneling apparatus, the instrument. This too strikes me as intensely beautiful. And these, I don't think Robert ever told me that he thought these were beautiful. And I understand that these are quantum gates. And so these are functional, and they do certain things. They manipulate quantum states of qubits, leveraging the principles of superposition and entanglement. I understand more recently that they can actually be reversed. They have an undo switch that classical computers lack. But when I saw these for the first time, I wanted to hang these on my wall. I didn't want to use them as a blueprint for anything. We drill down to as far as we can go into the physical substances that we know. We get to the point where things are no longer certain, where everything lives in the potential. Marilyn Robinson wrote in the New York Review of Books recently, down there at the quantum level where the clay is still in the potter's hands. Is it any surprise that there's a universe of possibility and beauty there? Maybe the most important thing that I've ultimately taken away from this whole business is that there are crucially different ways of viewing things. Perspective is part of it. Astronauts spoke about seeing themselves differently and the world differently after they came back from outer space. But maybe it's a matter of adjusting dimensions too. I'm drawn to this idea of momentum space, and K space, reciprocal space, so the various names that it has. I first came across the idea outside of the ARPA's lab. Actually, James was describing what a Fermi surface was, and he was using that metaphor of the lake where you add the molecules and the shoreline changes, and that's the Fermi surface. And I was looking at a picture, and I said, so that's what it looks like? And he said, no, that's momentum space. And then I felt the top of my head come off. And I was talking later with Andreas, and he said, he was describing the Fermi surface again, and he said, well, it's like a bucket, and it fills up from the bottom. So I go, okay, bucket, I got it. And he's drawing it like this. And then I was talking to Sarah again, and she said, yeah, but the bucket is three-dimensional. And then Shelley and I were talking later, and we went, all buckets are three-dimensional. It was a delightful concept. But the business of the atom, yeah, I tell you, I'm fascinated by strange things. I've done one experiment with ChatGPT since this thing hit the world. I otherwise haven't used it. I decided to sit down and ask it physics questions. But I set it up first. So I said, "Are you good with physics?" And it was like, "Yes, thank you. Shoot your questions away." I said, "And can you convert your answers into real lay people's language?" "Yes." And it was really cheerful, like Hal having had too much coffee or something. And so it's like I said, "Okay, what is momentum space?" And the cursor went blink, 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 blink. And about a minute and a half, and then it said the server was not responding. So this is actually the place where this started to fall into place, and I'm really conscious of time here, so I'm speeding up just a little bit. I have to pause and confess something, though. I do not understand the Fourier transform. I am aware that the Fourier transform allows you folks to toggle back and forth between the real dimensions and those of momentum space, and that fascinates me. It's almost enough for me. But the Fourier transform is a kind of a ghost step in this process that is the result of some key decisions that I made in high school. It's too late to regret those, but Alana showed me this picture here, which I understand can be referred to as a spectrum. And my brain accepted that largely on Alana's authority. And then Alana showed me this picture here, and my brain was rather pleased with that. And I said, "Oh, that's real space?" And Alana said, "Yeah, that's real space." And then the nickel dropped that this was a transformation from real space to momentum space. And I got goosebumps. I really did. So I would learn, as the time went by here, that there are a range of ways that you can toggle back and forth between momentum and real space. There are two ways you can look at crystal samples. And then there's the ARPAs and the STM examples that we've already looked at. And I don't really understand the math behind either the transform or the inverse transform that allows you to go back and forth. Now, where am I here? But I like this example that I'm going to give you in particular of what I believe is a similar type of transform because it, well, among other things, allows me to explain what that picture is doing up there, what these two gentlemen are doing listening to this radio. That guy is Felix Kuppenheim. He's my grandfather. And he was an engineer. And that's his brother, Hans, who was a physicist. He was an instructor in physics at Heidelberg University. And then he was in R&D at Siemens, where he studied X-ray tubes and luminescent screens, according to the CV that I have. The caption to this photograph reads, 1938, December, listening to forbidden radio. So we have some context here already. These are two Jewish men educated in the sciences and technologies, parents who were going to die within 2 years from the Nazis' persecution. They were going to flee Germany, go to New York and Ecuador, respectively. And here they are hunched over the illegal radio trying to scan the future for what lies in store. And my question is this: where is their offense being committed? They are themselves an offense by virtue of their bloodlines. But in what space were they committing this illegal activity? Were they committing a crime against the Nazi law across the physical dimensions of space? Listening to the BBC from Pforzheim, for example, about 700 kilometers away to the northwest? Or did the two younger men, that engineer and that physicist, did they commit this crime in the zone of frequencies instead? In some zone delineated across many geographic locations, off limits to them, some prohibited pattern of momenta. So my grandfather was a pretty decent logbook keeper himself. I found this out not long ago when I inherited his archives, and so he wins this whole keeping logbooks contest by, well, he might not beat you folks, but he had 10,000 pages of letters that he exchanged with his brother Hans there. And I'd like to give you a word of context on this archive. After Felix and Hans lost their parents in a tragic set of incidents in October of 1940, they were going to be deported to Gurs for ultimate destination Auschwitz. Their father was a famous doctor, Rudolf was his name. When the SS officer came to the door, he realized that Dr. Rudolf Kuppenheim was the guy who delivered him when he was a baby. So he gave the old couple an hour to get their things in order, and my great-grandfather, Rudolph, and his wife, Lily, took their lives. So these letters, after the two sons fled Germany, were not just letters about positional movement. And I want to illustrate with a little excerpt. Hans writes here, this is actually Hans writing to Felix, and he's written with some admiration about the United States where he's ended up. Felix is in Ecuador at this time. And he writes, "I did not emigrate. This word has been misused too often. Let me be absolutely clear and correct. We are the expelled ones." You'll forgive me if I hearken back to my hero, Mavis Gallant, who wrote that book, Varieties of Exile, but I see it written here now, not in the imagination of a great storyteller, but in the lives of my own ancestors. And I find myself thinking that this human data on these pages and these thousands, hundreds of thousands of words, that we can reconstitute Felix and Hans' experience in different ways. There are at least two ways of seeing this. Of course, the most obvious way is in real space. And so this is indeed how stories are frequently told. Joseph Campbell developed his entire archetype of the story by describing a journey, a physical journey away from the village and around the world and back. Whatever you think about Joseph Campbell, he was a real space guy. And we can plot Felix's real space journey pretty easily because he was such an intense record keeper. So we have all of these thousands of documents. We have the passport stamped J to show his expulsion. We have his itinerary that only an engineer would write, all of that detail about the waypoints across Russia and through Japan and Honolulu and San Francisco. And we have a postcard that he sent my mom from the SS Rakugo Maru, which was the ship that he crossed the Pacific on. I have his ticket. God damn, he kept his ticket. He was a record keeper. So I can appreciate his journey in that way. And this is a fraction of what I have, of course. But I find myself drawn, and in part because of what I've been thinking about here, to look at all this data and to try to devise a different representation using different dimensions. And I wonder if I map Felix's journey in that way. I could do this for any of those involved, but let's use Felix. What about a map of his autonomy measured against his movement in the world? What about if we looked at whose decision it was that he moved and then how much he had to move or whether he was able to move at all? What about if we considered how the artifacts would reposition themselves on this plotting in this logbook? And I find a different journey shaping itself. Here he is at home. That's him as a young schoolboy. They didn't smile for elementary school photos back in the turn of the century times. There's him at home with his family, with his favorite dog, Hasselman. My mom's in that picture, and my aunt as well. And then growing in prosperity through the years, he began to travel more. Here they are moving around rather freely to go visit his parents in Pforzheim after the family had moved to Munster. And then, of course, we know what happens. 1933 is the beginning of the end. Things pick up speed here, and now we have artifacts from a man who is being pushed and not drawn by his own will. We have the passport where his middle name has been changed to Israel. We have the suitcase with many stickers. We have that itinerary again. Only now, it's not so much a list of places that he has visited or places that he has intended to go, but the places over which he's being blown by forces behind him. I wondered for a long time at the meaning of the documents at the end of the journey, or the end of this part of his journey, the parts where he arrives in Ecuador, his permissio domicilio. This photograph of him at an early job. He loved trains. My grandfather loved trains, but he didn't choose these trains. These are Ecuadorian trains where he had to go. He had to leave his family behind. He was there because he had been expelled. Is that what I'm reading in this expression as I zoom in on that photo? Somewhat distraught, somewhat lost, somewhat confined. Is that the more compelling read on this map than the other one? To look at the typewriter in this way, where he typed all of those thousands of pages of letters, which I'm now processing into the archives with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. Is that the more significant fact then you could geolocate this typewriter to Latin America because it has an N tilde key. All the better to type sueño, to dream, or saña, to rage. What different map what do these different maps show us? And what different things can we learn about the man by looking at these? I'm interested in that. Two ways of seeing things, and I think that this residency has been part of igniting my curiosity in this regard. I've taken you rather far afield in this address today, so I want to wrap up. But I want to acknowledge that the project is bigger than these examples of my curiosity have suggested. Jeff has an enormous and exciting, as yet not entirely known to me, body of art that will contribute to this. Shelley is making crucial contributions as a curator and a writer as well. So something is shaping itself, as yet uncertain, but I have shared with you where I find myself in this process. So thank you very much, and I welcome any questions.
Excellent, Timothy. We've got time for questions.
Were you curious about QMI from the start, or was it something that got nurtured from other angles? I'm just curious why this collaboration.
Well, decision theory tells you that this is a bad way to make decisions, but this was an opportunity-based decision. I didn't know in advance that I would find this as rewarding as it has been. But the QMI, the Ars Scientia people put out a call. I have a relationship with Shelley that has been so fruitful in the past that I thought I would drop anything to try to explore this, what it was. As soon as I began our very first tour, or even our first conversations with James and Jeremy and others, I sensed that something incredibly rich was here without knowing what it would be. So the short answer is I didn't see it in advance. Yeah.
Timothy, what do you hope we'll do with the book when we get a chance to read it and look at it?
Well, reading it and looking at it would be about as much as I could ask. That's. I hope that the book will surprise you with the ways that what you're doing here can ignite people. And the whole nature of these Ars Scientia projects is that the ignition happens in really unpredictable ways. So it doesn't cause Jeff and I to go out and invent something that contributes back to what you're doing. We can't do that. But it will cause me to go and speculate and reflect in ways that just may form a sort of a refreshing new angle in on your own practices here. To us, this is so dense with possibility. I think it's entirely possible that being inside the machine, you don't see it as clearly. So I hope that maybe the book will be a bit of a light on that. This is what we look like to those who visit and know nothing.
You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that this is the first project you've written where you've known that you were going to write it before having a lot of the content or having the entirety of the story mapped out beforehand. How has that affected the sort of voices that have found their way into your book? Have you found that there's been more of an external involvement in the production?
There's always been a really external component to all of the things that I've written, so I don't know that that has changed that much. It changed the attendant anxiety of writing the book. That's the primary difference. It really isn't that much different than other writing projects that I've been involved in, except that I don't have an assignment in hand, which I typically do. Not an assignment necessarily from an editor, but even from myself, where I say, here's what we need to find out. So I need to talk to these people, and this is what I'm trying to get to. This was a really blind assignment. I didn't know what to expect to find. And you are well aware that your particular niche of expertise is an extraordinarily complex one. There's a reason why a lot of people are looking at this right now, because it is so fascinating that something that is quite difficult to understand could hold so much potential for things that are that we're sort of told could be so world-changing. With that in mind, I think I came in with not assuming some of the things that I would have assumed on other similar assignments, where it's like, I'll get my head around this. I just got to talk to someone for a little bit, and then I'll figure it out. How hard can it be? I never actually asked myself that question once, because I knew how hard it could be, which is to say fairly to extremely.
Yeah, I was just wondering when the book would be available and where one would obtain it.
I don't really know. Shelley's the better person to answer that question sometime next year, right?
Yeah, it will be available at the end of next year. I hope we'll have a launch, and it will be available through the Belkin and the UBC bookstore, and we'll update about distribution. Thank you, sure.
Yes, I loved and wrote down your advice for writing what you're curious about and writing toward what confuses you. And I actually think your story today was an interesting, maybe kind of place where those Venn diagrams connect. And it made me think that in some ways that's advice for graduate students, of which we have many in this space, and maybe advice for all of us writing toward what you're curious about and what confuses you. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your process and how you bring those together in this kind of advice to often we are inclined to back away from what confuses us, and yet this is maybe the thing to write into and to move into, and the momentum toward what confuses.
Yeah, it's a really complicated topic in creative writing because we are trying to do things that sometimes feel at cross purposes. On the one hand, we are very much trying to celebrate the individual voice and make sure that each person that comes into a given workshop doesn't feel like they have any less to say than anyone else. So that does feel like a very soft objective in a writing program, but it's an important one. We want to celebrate somebody who comes in from a community that hasn't traditionally been listened to, for example. Those are not small parts of our overall objective, they're large parts of our overall objective. And yet, as a longtime practitioner, only in academia for a relatively short time, I spent so much of my life not looking at me, but looking outwards to find material that I do want to counsel that as well. You have many important things to say, you notional grad student in creative writing, and I don't want you to ever forget that. Your voice is important, but allow yourself to be set on fire by somebody else's passions. Allow yourself to see something completely fresh because you've let yourself be confused for a while. So they can be in conflict because grad students only have so much time and they want to produce work and all of the pressures that I do appreciate. But I just try to present a balanced message, which is both to let yourself speak and to be yourself and to celebrate your own voice, but also be aware of where the richness of the material that lies out there. So I don't know if that answers your question. As a creative writing instructor, that's sort of where I go with that.
I was actually thinking of our QMI graduate students, so it's interesting the parallels.
From the outside, science feels like it already has a very healthy outward perspective, outward gaze, because there is you are moving yourself into the unknown. So it feels like the orientation of the project is already kind of that direction, but that may be partly a product of me not knowing how it is possible to grow fearful of the confusing, to turn away from something that is, I don't know, whatever the impulses are that might give rise to something different than that. But it feels to be like more so than in the fine arts. There's a sort of an impulse to look outwards already. That's my sense.
I was actually just going to build on what Kim was saying. I mean, I think we spend most of our time in confusion in this building, although it looks like we understand. I mean, because we're always trying to advance some piece of knowledge, it inherently means that we're confused. When students come in, coming from an undergraduate program, I think that's uncommon to feel confused all the time. And that's a transition that graduate students go through. But at the same time, there's probably things that we can learn from other fields like yours, where you talk about writing into confusion. I think we don't maybe do enough writing until we're ready, and sort of working through that. There's I think probably things we should learn from you in that space of how to think about things.
Well, that's interesting to hear. I definitely feel the reverse is true. Like I know the reverse is true for me. In other words, the reciprocal thing is true. That we have so much to learn from the way that the practices play out here, which is that sort of eager, hungry engagement with the things that you need to advance towards to understand. Don't ever retreat into experience and what you know. That would be what I feel like the scientific practice instructs me. So it's interesting. I'm fascinated to hear you say that. But you may be offering a lesson to outsiders that is actually the one that you're suggesting you yourself have to learn. But so isn't that good to know?
So if you want a chance to talk with Timothy some more, or Jeff, or learn about the book, we have a symposium coming up on Monday, May 15th, 2 o'clock at the UBC Botanical Gardens. So you can find that info on the Ars Scientia website, the Belkin website, the QMI website. Hope to come to that. Otherwise, let's thank Timothy again.